The way that philosophy is taught in Western university classrooms gives tremendous emphasis to the connection between Karl Marx and Hegel. So it's for that reason that I have a brief video here trying to bring that connection down to earth, try to put it on a more reasonable footing or basis. The problem with Hegel is not so much the legacy of textbooks he has left behind to us, but the attitude with which people read and reinterpret them today. So to give an example, in the philosophy of history, there's a really awkward and fumbling and peculiar justification of slavery. Hegel died in 1831. Let me just double check that. Yeah, 1831. Is it really such a big deal that he offered this series of bizarre philosophical excuses for slavery? It is what it is. What's bizarre and inexcusable is to hear modern Western academic philosophy lecturers, who are themselves very often Marxist or left-wing, giving abstruse, bizarre rationalizations for why somehow this set of excuses for slavery is profoundly psychologically insightful or still true today, or we shouldn't judge him by it, blah, 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 blah. Come on, guys. The legacy of text Hegel left to us should not be taken seriously in that fashion, and excuses should not be made for them. If you read what Hegel says about India, if you read what Hegel says about China, it is absolute garbage, even and especially compared to the brilliant research that was published during his lifetime and that was published in German. He was alive during a time when German awareness of Asia, of Asian studies, of Asian languages, of Sanskrit and Hinduism in India was blossoming. There were amazing breakthroughs in European research, those languages and those historical traditions happening. And then you come to Hegel's philosophy of history and what he has to say about India and China. And dude, it is laughably stupid. This is just some know-nothing bumpkin who somehow got himself a professorship of philosophy, passing judgment and making erudite-sounding gross generalizations that even in their own time were laughably stupid and laughably ignorant. And to give one other illustration of what his attitude was, early in Philosophy of History, this same book by Hegel, he makes the pronouncement that he feels that all of humanity should be united by the one religion that is most ancient and most original to mankind and most universal, something like this. And his claim is that this is Christianity and that it's Lutheranism. He was a Lutheran, that in some sense, the original and most ancient religion that's going to unite all of mankind is Christianity. Maybe it's an idealized version of Lutheranism he has in mind. Maybe it's not the Lutheran Church as it exists in Germany. Now, again, at that time, it was way past a proven fact that there were religions in India and religions in Central Asia that were much more ancient than Christianity, which you knew about a religion like Buddhism and Hinduism and so on. But even leaving that aside, within his time, the state of classical scholarship within the Bible and with ancient texts connected to and contrasted to the Bible, there's a lot of evidence even within Christian scripture of what the pre-Christian proto-Judaism and earlier Judaism, First Temple Judaism, you really can get a pretty good sense of the history of religion even within that kind of Judeo-Christian scholarship that, again, at that time was blossoming and sophisticated. And Hegel remains this kind of totally uninitiated, idiotic, bumpkin outsider to the progress of what's really going on in philosophy, philology, even archaeology, whether it's Asian studies or within Europe or what have you. And he's passing this haughty judgment on the history of civilization from his professor's chair in these peculiar lectures for teenagers. Well, it is what it is. It's a relic of that time and that culture. But what he has to say about the history of China, the history of India, it cannot be taken any more seriously than what he had to say about the motion of planets around the sun, which, by the way, he was hilariously wrong about also. So, I've kind of loosened up about this in a lot of ways. There was a time when I would have made a video like this wanting to really harshly condemn Hegel as one of the worst authors and worst philosophers in the history of the world. But the problem really is with our generation and how we regard him. There's something very similar, I would say, with Immanuel Kant. And in some ways, the problem is similar with Karl Marx. So what is the bridge from Hegel to Karl Marx supposed to be? It comes down to this same text I've already mentioned repeatedly, Hegel's Philosophy of History. He has some remarks in there about the concept of an historical class and of a universal class in history. And if you've read a little bit of Marx, or even if you saw my earlier video about Marx, you know that Marx uses similar terms when talking about the industrial working class becoming a universal class or becoming the leading class in history, this kind of idea. So there's a similarity on the surface there. Now, I'm not really talking about the young Marx. There's probably an argument to be made if you go back to the earliest available writings in Marx that there's some more influence from Hegel that can be talked about. I still don't think it's terribly profound. But when we're talking about basically the mature adult Marx, Marx's idea of social class is much more powerfully connected to the study of antiquity, classical scholarship in ancient Rome and ancient Athens, and then it's also powerfully influenced by the research that was coming back from the British Empire in India. Okay? Never forget, European imperialism in India predates European imperialism in North America. Now, not by a long shot, but in 1492, there already were Portuguese colonies in India. You had the beginning of this incredibly brutal cycle of piece by piece, India coming under European domination in detail. And of course, India, the history of India, held up a fascinating mirror to the history of Europe. And India was discussed, it was mentioned in ancient Greek and ancient Roman texts. There was some awareness of India in antiquity. So now Europe was kind of rediscovering India, and was rediscovering it in an era when they were less Christian. They didn't have to just understand India in terms of demon worship or something, not in terms of a strictly Dark Ages view of India. And of course, they start to appreciate that India didn't really have a slave system as Europeans did at that time. Europe was becoming a globe-spanning slave-trading empire, as you may know. But they had this caste system. They had a system of social classes. So Karl Marx, as a mature writer, he's influenced by the study of ancient Greece and Rome. And then he's influenced by his fascination. He had a really deep fascination with everything he could get his hands on, describing the social class system in India that was being discovered and analyzed by the British, partly because the British were conquering bits and pieces of India. And never forget, the British were in complex power-sharing arrangements and alliances within India also. It wasn't the case that the British just wiped India clean or something. Principality by principality, the British had to make accommodations with. Including local mercenaries who fought for the British and local royal families that said, okay, we'll support the British and you fight against the province next door to us. These kinds of petty local rivalries were very much part of the British divide and rule strategy. It wasn't the case that England ever just conquered India as a continent on the whole. It controlled a patchwork of smaller states comprising the grander enterprise of the colonization of India. All right, so with that having been said, Karl Marx is a guy influenced by all of those things as a mature author, much more than he's influenced by Hegel's theory of social class, of historical class, of quote-unquote universal classes. So what was it Hegel said, and what's the contrast that matters here? Well, what Hegel really says is less about history than it is about the writing of history. Because what he says is, at different periods of time, there's a different class that is the historical class, that is the only class history is written about. So you have long periods of aristocracy where the historical records, the books, are just about the aristocrats. You have periods of society where one man dominates society so much, one ruler, one monarch, that the history is really just written about that one man and his family, whether he's a king or a tyrant or what have you. And, of course, the contrast in everyone's mind, including Hegel's mind, is the legacy of ancient Greek writing from, Athens and to a lesser extent Rome, where you really have this participatory and somewhat democratic form of government, where the political class being written about really involves decision-making and participation and debate that, a much larger part of society participated in. Not the slaves, as you know. Women had a limited participation and so on. But, of course, that was a striking contrast to the way history was written in aristocratic periods and so on. Now, am I suggesting to you that Hegel writes about this in a down-to-earth, reasonable way? No. Hegel is a very pretentious, over-the-top, bombastic writer. And sure, he makes it sound as if he's stating something transcendental and profound and metaphysical, so on and so forth. And it's really not. There's really nothing of the kind there to be debated or discussed. What it comes down to is when he's talking about, in different periods of history, different social classes are the universal class or are the historical class that would dominate society. There's no further to go with this observation because it's fundamentally about the writing of history, the recollection of history. It's not about what actually unfolds historically. I mean, he's not claiming that the soldiers in the army didn't matter, that only the commander mattered. Obviously, that would be an absurdity. It's not even a claim that, in that sense, the slaves don't matter or the lowest and most oppressed people in society. So, is that really what's important to Karl Marx when Marx develops this notion, comes out of, very, very strongly out of Rome and Athens, that from Marx's perspective, at different periods of time, different social classes compete to take over the control of the government. And his feeling is that with different quote-unquote modes of production, with different economic bases for their supremacy, one period of history after another naturally tends to one form of government after another under the dominion of one social class or another. And you could say his gambit, his prediction, his theory, really in the sense of a hypothesis, was that he was living through a period of time in which the working class, specifically the industrial working class, would take over the leadership and domination of society from the bourgeoisie. Now, one of the problems with this model, of course, is that it is fundamentally kind of static in the sense that the government of Rome, or we can even say the government of the Roman Empire, doesn't really change that much from one revolution to the next. Don't forget, revolution was not a word invented by communists, right? You talk about revolutions in the history of Rome, and some of those revolutions were brought about by slave revolts, a few. Some of them were brought about by one kind of middle class fighting against the aristocrats, fighting against the patricians or the upper class. That happened repeatedly in the history of Rome. Many of the revolutions were just infighting within the elite, one group of aristocrats fighting against another and so on. But fundamentally, the structure and nature of authority of the Roman Empire and of the city of Rome itself remains pretty much unchanged from one period to the next. Now, this is actually something Karl Marx and Hegel have in common. What's the big example they both were living in the shadow of? Napoleon, right? So what happened in France during the period of the French Revolution and then the Directory or the Directorate, kind of more corrupt, less idealistic period of the French Revolution, and then that falls away and you have Napoleon taking over. You have various stages of France kind of sort of having elected government after the revolution, and then kind of giving up on that illusion and Napoleon taking over. And by the way, there's a series of revolutions within that French revolutionary period. It's not just one revolution. And when you look at that history, that again, Hegel very much lived through, and Karl Marx was obsessed with in retrospect, but it was fresh retrospect. It wasn't ancient history for Karl Marx. What you see in the analysis of the French Revolution and the breakdown of the French Revolution, and then Napoleon taking over, very much stage by stage, that history can be summarized as class struggle, as class warfare. But again, it's a very kind of static notion of what government is. Government as already existed under the kings of France before the first phase of the French Revolution, if you like. Government is taken over and operated by a different group of people after one revolution. And then you have a sequence of struggles where different regimes, very clearly backed by different social classes, even within Paris, fight and exterminate each other. Incredible brutality. In a manner quite similar to what we have in the historical record, definitely from ancient Rome. So, I mean, it's not democratic in the sense of a vote and then government changing hands. No, not at all. You have a period of time when the Jacobins rise up, and then the liberals, so liberal here meaning the moderate left, the liberals exterminate the Jacobins, hunt them down and kill them. So the far left is suppressed by the liberals. And there's a very clear difference in social class between them. Who represents the poor and who represents the wealthy but liberal. And then you have another period where, again, this is all French Revolution we're talking about here, where the liberals are fighting against the real royalist conservatives. So those are people who are wealthy and are, to some extent, aristocrats, or they're just conservative, wealthy people who still liked the monarchy and wanted to go back more to that kind of system. And again, they exterminate each other. It's absolutely, I mean, it's as brutal as the revolutions in ancient Rome on the streets of Paris. The body counts are not that high compared to the 20th century. It's not like Adolf Hitler massacring people on that scale. It's a few thousand people dying here and a few thousand people dying there. But it's persecution that involves, going to people's houses, murdering civilians, like dragging them out of their homes to be decapitated with the guillotine. The brutality and the kind of face-to-face, hands-on nature of that violence, it casts a huge shadow over the city of Paris and city by city in the rest of France. It's a patchwork. In some cities, extremely brutal violence. Some cities, not so much. Some were spared that violence when you get down to that level. So you have a sequence of revolutions in France, none of them sincerely democratic. None of them producing or ruled by or guided by elections. Elections play a background role in the French Revolution. But, sorry, just to finish the sequence, what's really the final stage of radicalism in the French Revolution, the last gasp of the left wing? As you go through this series of back and forth class antagonism, class struggles, the last phase is what's called the Society of Equals, also referred to in English as the Conspiracy of Equals. All right? And today, what most historians say is they were the first socialists, in our sense of socialist. And they were partly produced by the violence I've already mentioned. The Jacobins had already been exterminated and suppressed, and the sequence of back and forth suppressions, persecutions of the conservatives and the far left by the moderate liberals in the middle. But it's impossible to call them moderates because they were murderous power mongers. And what's produced by this is a genuinely new form of radicalism that says that they reject, the existence of the aristocracy, but they also reject the rule of these middle class bourgeois liberals, that their objective is to replace that with a society of equals. Okay, so organically and authentically, within the context of the French Revolution, Karl Marx found this inspiring symbolic touchstone that in many ways he just appropriated and Germanized and formalized and presented as his own philosophy. And he presented it not just as an analysis of the past, but as his projections for the future, as what he saw coming in the future. And of course, that's a ridiculous methodology, right? I can't present you with my analysis of what happened during the Great Depression, say World War I, Great Depression, World War II, and then say, okay, and now here's what I'm seeing. This is what's going to happen in the next 50 years. It's just ridiculous. If anything, you can say, well, that won't happen again because that already happened once. History is not going to repeat itself. But, obviously Marx found that tremendously inspirational. And that is, if you like, the underlying sentimentality beneath some of the seemingly Hegelian jargon about social class. Now, throughout Marx's work, he's obsessing over the French Revolution. And as is already well known, as has been mentioned on this channel, his analysis of Louis Napoleon, so this is normally called Napoleon III, Louis Napoleon, who's not the original Napoleon, his analysis of that is constantly presenting parallelisms, claiming that history is repeating itself, that there was the French Revolution before, and then there's this other French Revolution, there was a Napoleon Bonaparte before, and we have another guy who's kind of sort of like Napoleon Bonaparte now. He does that partly just as a provocative literary device, but partly that just really is the way he sees history and politics. And again, I mean, if you don't take it too seriously, kind of so what? I mean, you can just look at this guy, Marx, and say, well, you know what? Karl Marx was not an expert in the history of China. He was not an expert in the history of India. He wasn't an expert in the history of France. He wasn't an expert in the history of Rome or Greece or anything else. He was definitely not an expert on the science of economics. He dabbled in all these things. He got books off the library shelf. He read very widely. I mean, I have to give him credit for that. He continued to be inspired by new ideas. And he came up with this kind of ersatz political philosophy that some people found inspirational and took way too seriously, where people pretended that his analysis, which is in large part analysis of the French Revolution, really did reveal something about the mechanics of history that had predictive power for the next revolution. And, long story short, what he said was, during the French Revolution before, the first French Revolution, the one that ends with Napoleon, the problem was, he felt, the industrial working class hadn't developed yet such that this poorer class could really take over the government. The problem was the French Revolution moved forward and forward. You have the emergence of, as I say, socialism under the conspiracy of equals, but ultimately that was a period where the bourgeois class still dominated society, where counter-revolution, they couldn't get past counter-revolution, both of the bourgeois liberals, and of course also ultimately France is dragged back to monarchy of one kind after another, that France regresses after the revolution brought them closer and closer to this progress. So, this ends up being a kind of flattering video. I'm completely anti-Marxist, don't get me wrong, but the sense in which I can sympathize with Karl Marx's intellectual direction here is precisely that I see it didn't evolve out of Hegel. I mean, it's really a bad way to teach Marx is to present it as evolving out of Hegel. It evolved out of an analysis of the French Revolution, and again, very much in the shadow of Europe's obsession with Greece and Rome. And Marx was correct that democracy and voting and parliaments don't really explain very well what happened, the sequence of events in the French Revolution. Instead, tragically, you have a kind of phony farce of these elections. And by the way, in most of those elections, the liberal so-called Democrats, whatever, the liberals who are controlling the government, they would allow far fewer than 10% of people to vote. They basically only allowed people to vote who supported their government. And they were carrying out violent, brutal suppression of anyone who disagreed with them. So there was some voting, but it's really tragic. I mean, it really was a kind of dictatorship, with a fig leaf of symbolic democracy. That's what the French Revolution degenerated into. And again, they didn't just persecute the right and the royalists and conservatives. They were also persecuting the left very, very brutally, these bourgeois liberals. So, the sense in which I can sympathize with Marx is he was obsessed with the history of the French Revolution, and he was broadly speaking correct that when you look at that history, what you were looking at is a history of class struggle, a history of class warfare, a history of one social class after another trying to exterminate the other, at least just within Paris on a kind of small local scale, struggling to physically take over the government. And within that short time span, the nature of government itself, as I say, remains static. It's still, if you like, the king's throne, and it's just a question of who's going to sit on that throne. In the same way that within one period of time in the Roman Empire, you can see, one social class struggling against another for who's going to control the throne, and we're not really looking at profound reforms to government itself. So I think with that summary, you can also guess the way in which I profoundly disagree with Marx's whole direction. What you really need to examine in the history of Rome and in the history of France is the way in which the throne itself changes. The meaning of government changes. The meaning of the military changes. Like these things actually do transform during the lifetime of Napoleon, during the lifetime of Hegel, also, by the way. Actually, to give a very simple example, at the beginning of that period of time, military service is associated with punishment for a crime. People are recruited, by brute force and forced into military service. And, they're offered military service instead of a death sentence, this kind of thing. They're regarded as the dregs of society. And the higher orders of the military are all established by birth, by being an aristocrat and so on. And by the end of that time, say by the time Napoleon dies, the idea of the military being an elite form of upward social mobility, where promotion is based on merit, not based on aristocratic rank or birth, that it's a citizen's duty to serve the country through the military. Again, ideas that are now with us today. The transformation from a kind of dark ages idea of the military into a modern idea of the professional military, attached to ideas of nationalism and democracy. Ultimately, it's a kind of more democratic ideal of military service. You have the same vocabulary is being used for the army, but what is meant by those terms has profoundly changed. And in the same way, it doesn't happen overnight, but in that period of time, the nature of government, the nature of public service itself, the responsibilities of the government, the functions of the government, they're completely transformed within, say, 50 years, step by step, gradually, and much of it unplanned and unintentional. But, someone who lived through those 50 years, they would be able to say, what we mean by government before the French Revolution is profoundly, utterly different from what government does now, how it functions, and so on, some decades after the French Revolution had wound down, after the atrocities had, so to speak, been forgotten. So, yes, the elements of class struggle came and went. But if you think about government as a public service bureaucracy, it was completely transformed, often unintentionally. If you think of government as being democratic, at least partly, at least imperfectly, at least in principle, then for the whole world, including even like England, which was an enemy of France, then in exactly that period of time, the fundamental assumptions about elections and the role of government, they changed for everyone. And by the way, of course, that's not just because of France, the rise and fall of the French Revolution. Also, there's this little country you might have heard of called the United States of America. So that also becomes a symbol of what democratic electoral government, could be. So Marx is looking at that history, and very fundamentally, he is drawing the wrong conclusions. And is there a meaningful connection to the kind of aimless, meandering, self-indulgent reflections of Hegel in Hegel's philosophy of history? Not one that's worth talking about.